So what are we talking about today?
I was going to actually take notes. I feel incredibly stimulated today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I actually so I was going to write down 3 notes of things I wanted to talk about, but I didn't.
Oh,
Overstimulated, couldn't even write them down.
but you probably know what they are.
I think we'll figure them out. If we don't get to all three, it's better not to tease people with three and then not get to all three, because then it's just sort of unsatisfying.
Someone told me once that the key to living a good life is to have low expectations and then to surpass them
I think that's right.
instead of the other way around.
I think that's right. No.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm. Well, I guess let's just start with that. I've been agitated for about a week, I think, but I'm particularly like today. I hadn't been really delving into the whole GameStop thing, and I'll try and get this episode up, because who knows where this will be. Always a danger to talk about an event as it's actually happening, but today, I mean, I saw that like the head of, was it NASDAQ, was on CNBC or one of these places saying that trading needs to halt because the irrational volatility of this Reddit inspired but really almost 4chan-ish burst of I don't know what. I don't know. It's
Well, do you want to maybe, I feel like many of our listeners may not be aware of what you're referring to.
Well,
Can you give like a very short version of it?
Well, here, I mean, you're a real investor, so you can correct me what I've got wrong, because I've also found I've been thinking to myself lately about my sort of how in everything I'm just sort of an outsider and an observer, that I can watch what's happening on Wall Street and feel really unperturbed because I'm not really invested in it. Well, it's a really complicated story. So there's this company called GameStop, right? And I don't know. I guess I've seen it in malls before. It sells video games, but I think it also buys used video games and then resells them. And it's sort of like used to be a staple in malls. Malls are obviously going away, and that was clear even before COVID. But now with the entire world becoming socialized to buying everything digitally, the prospects for GameStop were even bleaker. And so, I mean, the parts that I guess it's important to note this. I mean, there was a guy who had made a bunch of money on a website called Chewy.com, I think, and he's I think made a lot of money on internet stuff, and he joined the board of GameStop, arguing that in fact GameStop is not so badly positioned if they can just sort of switch to digital. And I guess there's been speculation whether people were too bearish on GameStop for a long time, and this guy, I guess, gave some impetus to people who are more optimistic on it. But this is such niche stuff. I mean, this is a small stock that's not really making much money.
Damir, let me. Here's how I understand it, and this is like
well, I was just going to get to the juice part, which is that at the same time as this is all happening, I was just pointing out that there was some reason for questions of why people might be investing. But then it seems like there was some sort of what is it called? Wall Street Tips. Is that the name of the Reddit? The group on Reddit?
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever it is. I mean, but I've seen it described in some articles as they self-described as like 4chan for Wall Street, basically. I mean, like with a proper, that kind of nihilistic 4chan mentality. But these are actual people who are traders and day traders, and perhaps some of them even work for larger firms. Anyway, at some point over the weekend and early this week, they just sort of started running up the stock. I don't know, it's up 1,500% since Friday, I think, something like that. I don't know if that's, or 1,500% since its low point. It was up some sizable amount from like $8 to 60 or something, and now it's at, I think it's at 300 and something as we're recording this. And it's and the fascinating thing is that a lot of these sorts of hedge funds had shorted the stock greatly, and then this sort of surge of sort of small time money from Redditors basically piling onto this thing, driving the stock up, made many of these shorts that the hedge funds held completely disastrous. I think today, or was it yesterday, one of the big hedge funds just racked up a $10 billion loss, some 30% of its entire value just wiped out because of this bet that they had on GameStop, which was just overturned by this force of Reddit and, the rabble, basically. And so it's what I was getting at is like watching this on TV, you're having all these institutional investors and NASDAQ and all these other people complaining that the rabble is screwing things up because, in fact, there's no reason why this stock should have 1,500% increase in evaluation. It's completely not at all tied to fundamentals or whatever. So anyway, go ahead, Shadi. What I miss?
So that's right. It's quite literally about the wisdom of crowds. That if you have enough people who come together with a specific goal, you can see how their wisdom is reflected in public life, or in this case, in the stock market. And it's generally hard to do this because, there's a lot of stock valuation. So if you just get a few of your friends together, you can't really run up the price of a stock. But if there's a really popular channel on a website, including, say, on Reddit, then you're having literally tens of thousands of people reading this thread. And if they all act in concert, they can effectively run up the price, as you said, in a very artificial way. And I actually thought about buying GameStop yesterday because I was seeing the hype, and it seemed too high for me because it had already gone up, like God knows how much, like crazy numbers. But I thought, well, this is what people are saying, and it's still early on in the process. So I was looking at it yesterday, and it was hovering at around $85. And I was like, well, let me be like a wise investor and wait for it to go down to 70. It didn't drop to 70. It dropped to 80. So, close, but not close enough. And then now I'm looking at it and it's $330. But it's fascinating. And the reason why I started paying attention to this because our mutual friend Park McDougald was saying, if you have some money on the side, you don't have kids, and you don't have like a big mortgage that's sucking up all your cash, you should be investing in meme stocks. I think he was being ironic and somewhat trolly. I don't think he was really calling for people to make this their life or whatever, because obviously it's extremely risky to trade in this way. But he's just kind of having fun with it. It's a really fun story. And but I'm seeing a number of people who are like, hey, I put in a couple. They're not spending a lot of money, but just for the fun of it, they're buying 2 or 3 shares of GameStop and a couple shares of AMC. AMC is another one because it's like a dying movie chain that a lot of you guys are probably familiar with. People don't watch movies anymore in theaters because theaters are closed. And AMC is really struggling. So there's also this kind of fun in quotation marks, ironic aspect to this. They're looking at stocks that are very uncool and very lame, and they're essentially making these stocks the biggest things around today.
But so what struck me though, and why I ended up tuning in. I've seen, GameStop and headlines and things like that. I'm like, that's just some weird stuff. I saw Reddit. I sort of got the outlines of what was happening. But what really struck me today and why I'm so jazzed up by just sort of watching this right now, well, it's because you get these sort of institutional players no, this is not how things work. This is not, put a stop to it. It's not right. They're
angry at the masses.
Well, they're
like, who are these people? Who are these ordinary people who are messing with our money? That's basically what these institutional elite investors are saying. It's similar to how Republican elites thought about Trump supporters in the run-up to the 2016 election, that there's an elite that is supposed to decide these things. It might be a bad elite, a corrupt elite, but it's still an elite nonetheless.
No, precisely, and it just sort of, I don't know why I found it so sort of stimulating. Maybe we can sort of try unpacking this, but it's the thing I think that sort of motivated us to, or at least like partly has motivated me throughout these many months we've been doing this, and part of the theme that we're sort of hitting at this is, I mean, there's certainly no wisdom to what's happening with GameStop right now, but it's this force of just sort of just no, it's this force of pushing back on whatever kind of consensus is, and it's an eruption almost of. It's an eruption of irrationality that flies in the face of so much that we really just generally take as the bedrock of how we're building our world. A sane, rational, well-ordered, positive sum, world of goodness, right? I mean, in many ways, it's just like after Trump, this is just like another slap in the face of this kind of meliorist, democratic liberalism. I mean, Trump and Trumpism and populism in general is basically just a violent reaction against, call it that sort of Rawlsian conceit of, that we are all rational creatures, and rationality operates by people getting together and, emerging with the truth emerging out of it, right? And Trumpism is quite the opposite of that, and in a way, like, this is an echo of that. I saw an article somewhere. I'll dig it up in my bookmarks. Someone made that exact point already. That basically the forces of Trumpism are in fact identical to the forces behind GameStop. And what was interesting about the article, I read it very quickly, but he was making the argument in that same sort of condescending and disgusted way. And that's the thing that I'm finding sort of as I sort of gleefully, like really with a lot of glee, I'm watching this happen right now around GameStop. It's the same sort of thing. Like, I'm not a stock bro. I'm not on Reddit. I probably don't even like what these people are like. It sounds hideous in many ways. But there's something just amazing about watching this kind of rationalist consensus view, this idea just get ripped apart before your very eyes. And the thing about watching this GameStop stuff, I'm looking at it and I'm like, just like Trump, this will not make a difference. GameStop is not going to be worth $330, $370 because really, even at, I think, the best case scenario, there's nothing that would signify that even if they executed perfectly on all of this, on being like a successful online video game retailer, that they are competitive with, I don't know, Sony, which has its own console and it sells video games through the console itself, or Apple or Google with their own, online stores. Not sure there's any reason to think that GameStop can do it. And so the end result, kind of like with Trumpism, is going to be that things will sort of go back to normal. But what will be left over is this like incredible unease, about the sustainability of this kind of rationalist, well-functioning world that we've created ideologically in our own minds.
And that's what makes this, I think, such a great story is that, I mean, this is a little bit different than Trumpism in the sense that Trumpism actually ended up being quite destructive in terms of lives and livelihoods. I mean, there are obviously the comparisons we've discussed. I mean, in this case, there might also be lives ruined. Like if someone holds on to GameStop and then it crashes by like 300%, it could also like devastate people. But I think why it's such such an interesting and exciting story, even for people who don't follow stocks, is that it's ordinary people finding a way to kind of stick it to the man. And I think people have made comparisons to the 2008 financial crisis, which was a product of economic elites using very arcane economic tools to manipulate the market. And then we saw the blowback of that, at least in part. And they can get away with it. There are no consequences for them. And ordinary people now can apparently do the same and stick it to hedge fund investors who, as you mentioned, are losing tens of billions of dollars because of, ordinary people online using a thread on Reddit to coordinate their behavior. So I think it's sort of like a David versus Goliath story. That's who David and Goliath.
Yeah.
You know about them?
I think it's in that big book.
It's in the Bible, I think.
Yeah, that big book on my shelf. Yeah, the big Bible. That's what it's called.
But maybe that tells us something. These themes have been with us from time immemorial. These are the themes that we as humans love. The idea of the even like we watch TV shows about this all the time. I mean, I've been watching a show called Cobra Kai, which is partly about nerds who play karate. Is that what you say? Play karate? Or no, it's fight karate.
Play fight. Yeah, go on.
Yes. The nerds who are being picked on at school and they can't really get the attractive girl and girls don't even pay attention to them, but then they start to learn how to fight karate and then they can kind of rise to the top. I mean, we love these kinds of stories, especially as Americans, where there is this idea that the weakest can become the strong, or wait, maybe that's Christianity.
Well, the thing that I've been thinking of, I actually just texted her right before we started recording. It's our friend Karina Orlova. She wrote, I think, a really good piece back at the American Interest. I don't know, it's probably when was the movie The Joker out? And she was just comparing basically a lot of at the time there were all these headless protests that were happening around the world. And she did a clever job, I think, a good job of making the case that even that the Trumpist movement itself, everyone focuses on Trump. But if you remember the movie The Joker, right? I mean, It's this damaged person who is leading this thing, but he's not really. He's just sort of there's a mob destroying the city, and he's sort of wandering about it. And they've all put on clown costumes, and because he's become totemic, but he's not really in charge of anything, and he's not really leading. You said a group of people coordinating their actions through an online forum. I mean, yeah, except it's. Even in the structure of that sentence, that assumes that there's a group that is coordinating. There's a subject and an object, but it's this phenomenon is gelling together because of the medium of this sort of thing. And yeah, there's a kind of coalescing of resentments and anger and almost nihilistic glee to all of this, just sort of, let's destroy these hedgies and these short sellers and, show it to them. But, it's just fun. It seems like fun to, it seems from what I'm reading from people who are reading the thread, it just sounds like a riot in there. And it's that what's interesting in the sense that we're getting a real modern sense of this completely, disintermediated force, I mean, the internet's been constantly removing gatekeepers and just anything that basically gets in between the mass of some sort and then reality, right? And so this is there doesn't seem to be any sort of ringleader or anything to this. I mean, there are more or less prominent people in that mass of instigators on there, but it's completely, not rooted.
Yeah, in some ways, it's sort of like the Twitterization of the stock market, because, I mean, several decades ago, you wouldn't have enough people having access to online investing in real time. So they, an ordinary person would actually have trouble going online, and especially when there wasn't an online, you'd have to call up a broker and execute these trades in a somewhat, complex way. You'd have to put in time and be very conscious about it. Now you just sign on to your account with any of these online traders, and anyone, even with a very small amount of money, can trade these stocks. And there is no, as you said, intermediary. And we see this being replicated in every facet of life. People don't need to be columnists at a newspaper for their ideas to get a large audience. They can start a Substack, or even people who aren't prominent. Sometimes they can go viral on Twitter and it'll just be an ordinary person. So I think that this says, but it's also, I think, this point that there are a lot of people who are nihilistic. That's the word that you used, Damir.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily bad, but they don't care about the system. They don't care about norms. They want to burn things down because they've had an accumulation of resentments over years or perhaps decades, and rightfully so. It's understandable that people would be angry, either for economic reasons or political reasons. And it's a natural, I think, instinct to want to take matters into your own hands. If you look at elites and you you think to yourself, who are these people and why should I defer to them? And that's why I think what you've been writing about, and I think what you want to write about more, as far as I can tell, is that, if Trump is a symptom and not a cause, he's a symptom of a broader malaise in our society where people don't really have a stake in the system. There's something dark, and people want to express that darkness. And just because Trump went away doesn't mean they're going to stop.
I definitely, I feel like that it just keeps coming up whenever I sort of sit down to scribble something out for wisdom of crowds, or just in general when I'm talking. But let me just then push us into the other thing. This would have been one of the the second of maybe three bullet points, which is this. The really interesting thing about the rise of Biden, and all of the pageantry of him being, his inauguration and the sigh of relief, there wasn't any violence, and the end result has been this kind of idea that now we can cast out this demon Trump and it's all going to be fine. The weird side thing that comes out of this, and it's your most recent essay at American Purpose, I think, usefully outlines the shape of the problem, is that you talk about liberalism and tolerance and how this sort of works, sort of a classical form of liberalism. We'll put a link to this and you can talk about it some more.
Yeah.
And a liberalism of I guess, would you say is fair to say, like a liberalism of difference and a liberalism of some sort of conformity is one way to maybe put it, right? And so the interesting thing to me is that with Trump gone, there's this inordinate focus on exercising the person of Trump, which, again, I think pragmatically is not a bad idea at all, because the man himself actually can do a lot of damage. But now it's shifted to this other thing, which is that the source of these ideas has to be expunged. And this is what was interesting, again, why I became so agitated and enthused watching the GameStop story today, was watching these establishment people come out on TV and be like, stop the madness. These people have to be stopped. We can't let this happen. I think I tweeted something that was like, it's first democracy needed to be saved from the rabble, and now capitalism itself needs to be saved from the rabble, And that's the moment that I think that I'm really most sort of transfixed with right now. So I don't know. Talk a little bit about your essay and about this question of toleration and liberalism. But I'm struck by the moment right now being this desire to, like, now that irrationality was supposedly defeated in the democratic sphere, we must now do everything to protect democracy from irrationality again.
Yeah, well, so I think that the first things that people, and maybe not people, elites or people who are intelligent or well educated don't really like people all that much. And that's a problem, because democracy depends on and relies on the idea of the people, that you have some way of aggregating or articulating mass preferences. And this was always fine historically when you had enough gatekeepers who could mediate the masses and make sure the masses didn't go overboard. But now I think the crisis in democracies all across the world, and we see it in such a diversity of countries, whether it's India, Philippines, Hungary, Poland, the US, Brazil, is that without mediation, elites end up developing a disdain for democracy, for the democratic idea. If by democracy we mean the rule of majorities. Obviously, there's always limits on what majorities can do, but majorities are generally more powerful than minorities in democratic countries. And that's sort of where we're at now. What happens when the masses are out of control? And I think the real subtext, or actually just the text of the explicit text of the past 4 years, has been what to do, like this question of what to do about the unfurling of mass sentiment and how to regulate it and how to keep it under control. And I think that the dilemma is that there is no way to keep it fully under control. You can push back and you can try, but that at the end of the day, especially in large, unwieldy countries like ours, there's just too many people and there's too many angry people. And, we're 330 million people in the US. Even if the majority are not angry, you just need, and we've sort of talked about this in previous episodes, in the case of the storming of the Capitol, you had really just hundreds of people who marched onto the Capitol, and then a smaller subset that actually got in, and that was enough to really cast doubt over the entire democratic process. And that's why it was such a shock that such a small number of people can have such an outsized effect on our self-perception as a nation, as Americans, so on and so forth. Damir, you mentioned my piece, and I'll try to tie that to this, but we'll include a link to the piece. And obviously I'm biased because I wrote it, but I would highly recommend that you guys give it a read.
Yes.
So it's called The Tolerance Dilemma. And I draw on the philosopher John Gray's work. And John Gray wrote an excellent book that we actually read together, Damir, for a symposium that we were part of a couple months ago. But it's called, his book is called The Two Faces of Liberalism. And he, I think, captures this really well, that liberalism contains an inherent contradiction. And that's why when we talk about liberalism, we always have to specify what kind of liberalism we're actually talking about. So for some early Enlightenment thinkers, toleration was a means to peace. It was about coming to terms with the fact that people are in conflict with each other, there's violence, and toleration was a way to say, let's stop fighting. We're not going to agree on certain things, but there has to be some level of tolerance. So that way we don't sort of resort to arms when we disagree, right?
Yeah.
Then there's the other approach to toleration, which is more ambitious and which is more ideological. And this would be associated more with someone like John Locke, where tolerance is a means to the end of truth or reason or rationality. The idea here being that if you create you want to have tolerance because tolerance promotes a free marketplace of ideas. And then what does a free marketplace of ideas do? It allows people to debate and to discuss in this deliberative manner. And the idea, and it's kind of a fantasy because it doesn't actually turn out this way, there's this idealization of the marketplace of ideas that if you have people in good faith talking to each other, the best ideas will rise to the fore, and then society will produce truth, and societies will produce reason and rationality. And that's what tolerance is supposed to serve. It's supposed to serve this endpoint, right?
Yep.
And I think what we found out is that if you create this free marketplace of ideas, or in this case, the free marketplace of stocks, or the free marketplace really of anything, it's not always the best people or the best ideas that rise to the fore. Sometimes unreason or irrationality get the better of us. And I think that's where you really get to this dilemma and to this contradiction, that liberal toleration doesn't necessarily lead us to the promised land. And this was the ambition in the 17th century and the 18th century, in this early period of thinking. There was this belief that truth was something that we could strive for, that we could establish. And once we established truth, then we could move towards this more utopian society. Maybe not utopian in the socialist sense. There would still be some basic level of freedom and disagreement, but there wouldn't be too much disagreement, because if you have more education and more good, and people are good and they're well-meaning and they're talking to each other, then they're going to have an interest to come to an agreement about the good life, about what is right and what is true. And as we have found out in modern societies, they have not been able to come to those conclusions. The modern story, I think, is that people are moving away from a common conception of truth. They don't agree on what's right. They don't agree on what constitutes the good life. And this is really counter to what many early Enlightenment thinkers would have expected. I think if they were here today, they would have found much of this shocking.
Yeah. I'll second what you said. The essay is very, very much worth reading, and I hope our listeners do click on through and give it a read. The interesting thing, this is just a half remembered side comment. You may know better since you've been marinating in this a little bit more. But if I'm not mistaken, Locke's Toleration and his treatise on tolerance was also directed ultimately at Catholics, right?
Yes,
and
atheists
and
too.
atheists, but it was Catholics was the really striking part, and the striking part being that the truth of religion would also come out of rationality, which is something we've lost, if I'm not mistaken. That in fact, like the one true faith would even arise out of this kind of interplay of ideas. I believe that was a part of his sort of core conception. So that's an element of that sort of early liberalism that's completely lost to us, because in the intervening years, the very idea that religion and rationality go together in any way, shape, or form has been rendered in the popular consciousness as an absurdity, of course, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a funny little aside that doesn't really take us anywhere. But
no, but I mean, it's worth noting Locke did view Catholics as being irrational.
Yes.
That in part because they had dual loyalties, that they had to listen to the Pope, and therefore they couldn't develop their own capacities and faculties of reason and individual deliberation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So he felt that Catholics undermined, in a very basic way, the idea of the marketplace of ideas, because they couldn't develop their own ideas and they couldn't follow the truth because of the figure of the Pope and the institutional domination of the church.
It's important to sort of dwell on that, though, I think, because it gets us at some of this stuff about free speech, which predates all of this GameStop stuff and was agitating me last week. God, I don't remember the guy's name. He's that lefty. I don't know if he worked for AOC, but he's just sort of a Twitter personality.
Oh,
now.
Is he the one who has like the handle on Twitter that says every billionaire is a policy failure?
Maybe that's him. I don't know. I didn't notice.
Okay.
Anyway, whoever it was tweeted something, went on this Twitter thread that was then shared broadly about, how we need to regulate Fox News out of existence. And it's one of those things that to me, I've always made the case, sort of the impish case to people when they come at me about disinformation and untruth and the rest of this. I've always said, especially in the American context, if Fox News didn't exist right now, I'd turn around and invent it and retire rich. Because obviously there's a demand for it. It's completely backwards to say that there's a supply and demand sort of thing, and that now you're getting this kind of sense of defending democracy from the rabble. And this is why I've never really liked this idea of misinformation, or disinformation. I wrote an essay a while ago, also at the American Interest, talking about basically, how the problem of foreign influence and disinformation is like fundamentally incoherent at its core. And you have to sort of unpack it. And I try and do that, not with any great success of like where it ends up. But it's really stuck with me that this idea of the truth, and that the truth leads to a kind of, a salvation of society, and that we must be protected from untruth. That's one form of viewing this sort of liberal project that I think, for all of the debt we may owe Locke in the United States, because America, as you say, was it's always been unwieldy, and has been sort of uncontrollable. It never really took off here, and it's been instructive to read these ideas coming out now about we should return to this or that, limit speech this way or that way, and see the echoes of basically how Europeans have approached democracy after Nazism and the horrors of World War II. Is that, we can't trust democracy, and we can't trust liberal democracy to, basically self-sustain. It must be protected. It's a delicate hothouse flower. And that's always been not the American way. And it's interesting to watch it now become at least a dominant discourse among elites. Yeah, at least among the in the waters we swim.
And this is where I think, Bruno, who, for those of you who missed it, would highly recommend last week's episode with Bruno Machais, the former Portuguese politician and now author, who's really been great on this. And I think that I've had some skepticism and maybe reservations about aspects of Bruno's argument, but I think the more I think about it, I think there's something extremely useful about his frame of analysis, that once you sort of take that into your toolbox as an observer of politics, it helps you out a lot, and it helps you identify things you wouldn't otherwise, identify. And I think that disinformation brings us closer to some of this, because disinformation, and either that disinformation as a problem to be solved, or the attempt to eradicate disinformation, all of this is operating in a kind of fantasy land that is somewhat divorced from reality. Because first of all, it assumes that if you eradicate the supply of disinformation, then there won't still be a demand for it. And it also assumes that there can be someone or some institution that arbitrates what is false and what is true. And that to me has always been a very frightening idea. And that's why I've never been comfortable with the idea of disinformation and fighting it, because to fight disinformation, inevitably, you have to centralize power. And that's not just on the political level. You also would have to centralize power in tech companies, because, if that's where a lot of this unregulated discussion is happening, and you're worried about the spread of misinformation, tech companies are going to have to clamp down. So all of that makes me nervous, because it gets into this realm of fighting a kind of war that is operating in a parallel universe. It's real, but it's also not completely real, because a lot of it is happening in people's minds, where they think it's about like someone who's basically waking up in the morning, and he or she thinks to he or she.
Yeah, I don't know. You pick a pronoun, my friend.
See, yeah, hey. He or she are wanting himself or herself to basically they see themselves as fighting these forces of darkness that are very hard to define. And it's just a weird way of looking at the world to say that and it's also very presumptuous that someone would actually think that they have a monopoly on the truth, or that they can even decide who are these bad purveyors in our country. Presumably 74 million Americans who voted for Trump. They are the ones who are under the sway of untruth. And then we're the ones who have to come and tell them, hey guys, hey Trump supporter, let's sit down with you and let's try to explain to you very carefully why you are wrong and why your analysis of the world is just completely unfounded. And it's also a twist on the Marxist idea of false consciousness. Yep. And it's worth noting that Marxism is itself a product of the Enlightenment. It's all about reason and rationality. It is about finding objective material truths that can organize humankind and society. And that's why I think once you become obsessed with rationality and reason, it can actually take you closer towards totalitarianism, because if you have found the truth and you've been able to sort of isolate these scientific truths about how the market works, how economic production works, how society works, then there's no need for dissent. There's no need for opposition. You have reached the promised land. And that's why whenever I hear about disinformation, I think a little bit about false consciousness, which is originally a Marxist idea. This notion that the proletariat or the members of the working class, they are voting against their own interests by supporting capitalist parties because they don't know better. They're under false consciousness. And then it's the job of the good communist or the good Marxist to sit the working class person down and tell him or her, you don't realize what your own interests are. And all of these discussions that we're having now are about basically elites sitting people down and saying, you don't know what's right for your own good.
Yeah.
And get with the program and we'll help you. And there's something very patronizing about it. There's a very strong educational component. And that's why you hear a lot of discussion about education and providing the right information, because it's the enlightened elites who help the unenlightened masses, the rabble, as you might call them, help them find the light.
So here's a question for you. I mean, I feel like I know the answer, but hearing you explain it, I think would be helpful to me and just interesting. Yet, despite everything you just said, would you identify yourself as a progressive? And if so, is your version of, would you allow that your vision of what progress is very different from what almost everyone who might identify as your ally would believe? In the sense that I would guess that your definition of progress is something very provisional and saying you would confidently say that progress is what I think progress is, and therefore that's what makes me a progressive because I'm for changing things, but I have no ultimate truth claim to any of it. Is that right? I mean, how would you
It's
how would you do that?
It's an interesting question, and I wonder do you think I'm a progressive?
I mean, I've always had my doubts.
Okay, let me give it a shot.
Yeah.
I do self-identify, if pushed, as a progressive. I mean, people don't ask me the question all that much anymore because they're like, we lost him. He's done
a while ago. Yeah.
Forget about it. I have my views about how society can progress. I think progress is possible. I think, first of all, I define progress in a different way than a lot of people. But secondly, I don't think there's anything absolute about my conception of progress, which you sort of alluded to, that I'm very skeptical of absolute truth claims. Now, I do believe in absolute truth in a kind of ultimate sense. So I'm not a moral relativist. I am accused of being a moral relativist. But for example, I do believe that God exists, and I believe there is a kind of order that derives from God. Maybe order is not the right word. I don't mean to suggest that in a kind of integralist sense, but I do think there is a kind of logic to the universe, and that ultimately derives from a higher power. I do believe that some things are true. So I'm a believer. So I'm Muslim. So I believe there are, various things that are true about Islam from a creedal standpoint, so on and so forth. So I'm not someone who says that all religions are equally valid. I think, so for example, do I think that, I hope this doesn't get me into trouble, do I think that Buddhism is equally valid to Islam? No. Does that mean I think Buddhism is bad? No. But I'm not going to pretend that they are equivalent from my standpoint. Now, it's also odd that I would even be worried that would be controversial. I assume in some progressive circles, being explicit about that might be controversial. That, I have judgments about what is more right or less right on a kind of relative spectrum, right? But I just don't think those questions really have to be resolved in this world. And I don't think it's the job of democracy to come to some final answer or conclusion or consensus about how society should be ordered. That's what I'm skeptical about. And that's why, so for example, I mean, I do think that government should have a pretty significant role in the economy. And that's what, I mean, I'm not a socialist by any means, but I'm sympathetic to how someone like Bernie Sanders viewed the economy and using government power in an interventionist way to address inequality. I think that's important because I see inequality as being this, one of the sources of our modern ills. That said, I also don't have a problem if the Bernie party, or in this case, the Democratic Party, if Bernie had won, if they had lost after 4 years or after 8 years, I would say, hey, the Bernie-led Democratic Party is not an absolute truth. It's something that is subject to the ebbs and flows of the democratic process. So if after 8 years Republicans win, then it's completely legitimate for them to try to undo what Bernie did. And that's how democracy works. Different parties come into power and they try to undo what the other did. Of course, they have to do so through peaceful, legal, democratic means. So they can't just make America into a dictatorship and then say, hey, we're everything Bernie did, now we're taking over and we're going to go outside the law. And I don't even know how that would really work in the US context. But anyway, the point is, I don't think that any absolute endpoints or final victories are possible in this world. And I think I've come to terms with that. I've come to terms with the contingency of human life in a way that I hadn't really been fully cognizant of before. So if you had talked to me 10 years ago, I wouldn't say what I'm saying now.
So, all right, that all makes sense.
But feel free to push back. There's probably some tensions there.
I mean, there were some little. I thought it was interesting that you said that an enforced relativism, religious relativism, would be the norm among people who otherwise feel like they do have access to the truth. That in fact, a certain kind of religious relativism is the truth, because in fact, these people don't believe in anything. Your allies. But I thought that's a fun little aside there. That's not an inconsistency in you. It's an inconsistency in the idea in them. But so let me ask you this one then. And maybe this is a way to tie a bow around the whole conversation. What's endlessly entertaining about GameStop is that while my heart goes out to the billionaire hedge fund that finds himself now 80% poorer. And I'm sure it's hard, and I'm sure he's having a really rough week.
Damir, are you trolling now?
I am trolling right now. What I'm getting at is that though my heart goes out to him, the costs of this episode, like I said, it's not going to change anything. Like GameStop's not going to become like a blue chip stock, and at some point it's going to ebb away, and as I was saying, it'll leave this sort of lingering sense of disquiet, which I find actually pretty bracing, which is what I like about, like I said, it's sort of the motivating thing about wisdom of crowds and actually the whole Trump moment. However, you gestured at this earlier when I said this too, is that like Trump himself was actually did leave a trace, a bigger trace. Arguably, I think he changed a lot less than I think when we look back on it, and we have talked about it. It's been performative in so many ways, lots of shirt rending and, high theater, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, the monster gets out and storms the Capitol January 6th, and for all the reasons, I think it's an important and that will leave a trace, I think, in our sort of body politic. But overall, Trumpism, there's something to that. From where I'm sitting, that's sort of parallel to this GameStop thing. In the end, the main damage is to our faith of like a properly, rationally ordered world. But then let me push you on that because, I don't think there's any remedy, at least, all the remedies being put out in panic right now to the GameStop thing, like, oh, we need to ban this kind of trading, and it's nonsense. It's just panicked nonsense. However, maybe you would say that there is something that we do need to do and take into account, that like Trumpism went too far and actually did leave lasting damage. So should we be doing something? Is there something to the people that say that we ought to be doing something about information, about platforming, about I don't know, how does one secure democracy from this irrationality? I mean, or is that just like a dumb way to look at it? I think it's a dumb way to look at it, but I don't know.
Look, I don't think it's an issue of pro-regulation versus anti-regulation when it comes to these bad ideas or these perceived threats. All of us believe, I think, that there are red lines. What we disagree on is where to draw them.
Yeah.
So I believe in red lines. I just want to draw them as minimally as possible. Maybe minimally isn't the right word, but so I think that I've brought this up on the podcast before. So we have 330 million Americans. That's 100% of the population. I want to ensure that the people in our country who stay within the fold are as close to 100% as possible. Now, there's always going to be a couple percent that are beyond the pale that actually cross the red lines, even if they're somewhat minimally defined. And for me, those would be, so for example, someone who supports slavery, obviously a very small number of people, presumably, at least who would say that explicitly. Those are not people that I think should be platformed or have a voice, and we can, regulate that kind of content. People who support the use of violence explicitly. Now, we can debate what that really means, and that is a debate that folks have over Twitter, because from a First Amendment standpoint, there has to be an imminent threat, which is actually a very high bar. So it's very difficult generally to restrict the speech of, say, Nazi groups, because they might call for violence in a broad way, but if they're not actually specifically targeting individuals, explicitly, it's hard to actually legally charge them for anything, which is why they've been able to march and protest. And then the ACLU, at least in the past, would defend their right to march in certain cities and towns and so on. But I think, unfortunately, we're at a moment where my very minimalist approach, however minimal it is, it's going to have to bring in, there's more bad people now. So like 6 months ago, I would have said, 1 to 2% of avowed white supremacists and whatever it might be, those are the people beyond the pale. Unfortunately, today, we might have to extend that. And I'm torn about this, because people who are not willing to respect democratic outcomes, apparently, there are quite a few more of them in this country than one might have expected. Now, ordinary Americans are different. I don't think that, if you ask an ordinary Trump supporter, should we respect democratic outcomes, you'll probably get some interesting responses. First of all, you'll probably get them to say that they think the election was rigged and that Trump actually won. But I don't think that's necessarily disqualifying. Like, I don't think that person should be shunned from American life, and that they should be, like, I don't know, fired from their job and like pushed out of their local church or whatever, because, people have weird ideas, and it's always a question of to what extent do those bad, dangerous, weird ideas actually get reflected in policy. And this is where I think there's an interesting conversation about some of the folks in the House of Representatives on the Republican side who don't seem to be small d Democrats. And I think we're going to have to work that out as a society, is that where do we actually want to draw this line? But my general instinct is to draw as few lines as possible and to be very careful about precedent setting. So in the case of Trump being banned on Twitter, I see that as a kind of exceptional situation, and that we had to do what we had to do. Wait, we had to do what we... Yeah, that's right.
We did what we had to do. Yeah.
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 Yeah. We did what we had to do. And but I wouldn't want that to be a new norm, that we start thinking that anytime we have speech like the kind of speech that Trump would engage in, that our immediate thought is to say, let's ban them from Twitter or other platforms. We had to do that in this case because it was a clear and present threat to American democracy. People might debate that, but I think there was a reasonable case to be made at that particular moment that quite a lot was at stake, and that this was the right move. But it should not be. No one should be happy that it got to that point. No one should have been celebrating the fact that Trump was banned from Twitter.
So, I mean, this is, I guess, maybe also gets us to the last week's notes thing that I wrote against democratic minimalism, or at least like a concern that it's not enough. Because, I guess hearing you talk here takes me back to what was driving me to write what I wrote, which is that that I don't think this is a case of accepting or rejecting democratic norms, or in any case, that's not how anyone thinks about it. I mean, you gestured at it yourself just now in the idea that at least the controlling narrative among the people supportive of this idea that Trump's election was stolen, they would absolutely argue that they are for democracy, that they're defending democracy. So what's gone, what's missing, and I think I didn't manage to capture that in the notes, and maybe this is productive to that, is that like it's that sense of trust and sense of shared destiny, a shared unified destiny, which just putting disparate groups together into a democratically minimalist sort of system and saying play by the rules, and you have to just internalize that you'll get your turn eventually, or at least have input in it, and your minimal rights against like complete domination and repression are guaranteed. That's an academic way of looking at it, because what the element that's missing there is trust. And trust comes from this sort of ineffable group identity, which is I trust you rather than someone else. And I keep you within my tribe, my family, my friend group, my tribe, my people. And I trust you more than a foreigner, an outsider. And it's that kind of tribalism, call it a base kind of tribalism, without which I don't think you can have democratic minimalism. Because I think you can where democratic minimalism makes sense if you embed it in this concept of a whole and say, well, that whole doesn't have to be as cohesive as a tribe or as a family or as someone that so you can extend that level of sympathy and trust more broadly if it's guaranteed by a certain set of democratically minimalist rules. But democratic minimalism in and of itself, and just say, well, we'll take two groups of people that view each other with utmost suspicion and just say, hey guys, there's these rules, just learn them and it'll work. I think it's not enough. And I think that's what we're facing here. And so that's why it's like, when we talk about, I mean, again, I think as a frame for talking about things, for talking about difference, for talking about how democracies work, it's sufficient and interesting and enlightening to talk about democratic minimalism. But if you're leaving out that tribal element of it, and the fact is that like any polity can only exist if you have like an insider group against an outsider group and an outsider threat. And if you expunge that from your analytical frame, you're missing something really important. And I think that's what we're getting at right now, is that the threads that bind the polity together have frayed badly, perhaps. Maybe not irreparably, but badly. And that's I guess what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I think you've better than most, or at least I don't know if a lot of people have tried, but you've been able to poke a hole or two in my theory of democratic minimalism, and it's something I have to ponder a little bit more. I think I have to have a better answer for some of these. I mean, even if they're not like outright objections, they are weaknesses in how I articulate this democratic society. And I think I'm almost tempted to say that to the extent that there are problems with my argument, I'm not sure that there are solutions. Just as I would say, just as there are problems in life and in politics more broadly, not all problems have solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, at some level, we may have to accept our fate. That, and this is why I think sometimes the best you can do is muddle through. Because if you can't find a solution, and if you can't recreate trust after it's been dissolved or destroyed, then you got to live with what you have. And I don't really see a future scenario where trust is rebuilt in the U.S. to the extent necessary. And I think part of the blame, I mean, certainly we can talk all we want about how Republicans and Trump supporters are to blame, but I think there is something quite frightening for tens of millions of Republicans and Trump supporting Americans when they think about a country that appears to be so dominated by the center left and maybe even the left in some areas, dominated in cultural and political terms. I mean, cultural hegemony is clear, I think. Arts, film, music, so on and so forth. It's not easy to turn on your TV or to turn on Netflix and find anything that gives a sympathetic depiction of, let's say, Christian conservative life, for example. It exists, hard to find. So, and then obviously now the Democrats control the House and the Senate and the presidency. I think that it's that intertwining and that combination of cultural and political authority that can sometimes create very disproportionate and irrational, if we want to go back to that, irrational responses.
Yeah.
So, I think that's just where we are right now. We are sort of getting, since we are getting close to our sort of like arbitrary time that we have to stop.
Yeah.
I do want to, I'll maybe do this again at the start. We forgot to do like my little marketing pitch at the start, but for those of you who got to the end of this, as always, for you devoted listeners who want to listen to every single minute. So if it's 67 minutes, you want to get to the 67th minute. For those of you who are committed, I would just encourage you, as I often do, to consider becoming a member and a subscriber. Those are interchangeable in this case, by paying a few bucks a month. As you will know, we've been ramping up content, more content that is paid, and we think it's very good content, a little bit distinctive, unusual. That's what you come to us for. We will maybe also properly announce him at the start of the next episode. We did finally bring on an assistant editor. His name is Matt Weinset, and you'll probably see him in some ways online on the website doing his thing. So it's a team of 3 now, so we're excited about that. But if you want to support this kind of expansion of the Wisdom of Crowds vision, go to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. And then subscribe. And I think we're about to do a bonus episode right now after we get off. So, if you want to listen to that, that's for subscribers. And I don't know exactly what we'll talk about, but probably something fun and quite personal because we'll be speaking to a smaller audience so we can be more unfiltered.
Yeah, that's right. More racy.
More racy.
All right,
okay,
Shadi.
Damir.
Yeah.
Talk to you later.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.